A black woman boards a flight. Moving with quiet grace, she places her bag in the overhead bin and takes her seat in first class by the window. As the plane fills, a flight attendant approaches, her smile thin but firm. "Ma'am, I think you're in the wrong seat," she says, eyes scanning the ticket without much care. The woman politely offers her boarding pass, but the flight attendant barely glances at it before shaking her head. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to the main cabin. This seat is taken." A hush falls over the surrounding rows. Passengers exchange quick glances but say nothing. The woman doesn't argue. With quiet dignity, she gathers her things and walks toward the back of the plane. Her head held high. But 4 minutes later, everything shifts. As the plane prepares for departure, the pilot steps into the cabin to greet the passengers. And when he mentions his wife seated at the rear, every eye follows his line of sight. The realization sweeps through the cabin like a gust of wind. What happened next caught everyone off guard. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit subscribe. The boarding process was like every other. The familiar chorus of announcements, the rolling of luggage wheels over polished airport tiles, and the quiet shuffle of passengers seeking their assigned places filled the space. It was a symphony of routine, predictable and orderly, as though everyone knew their role in the delicate dance of air travel. Sophia Gray entered this scene with quiet confidence, her steps measured but firm. She was dressed impeccably, her tailored blazer and silk scarf whispering elegance without ostentation. Yet, as she moved through the terminal, she felt at the subtle shifting of gazes, the double takes that lasted a beat too long, and the polite but distant nods of acknowledgement. Sophia had grown used to these looks. They didn't pierce her armor as they once did, but they were ever present, a shadow that followed her no matter how brightly she shone. At the gate, she handed her ticket to the agent, who barely glanced at her before offering a perfunctory smile. "Enjoy your flight," the agent said, the words clipped and devoid of warmth. Sophia thanked her with a nod, stepped onto the jet bridge, and felt the cool, metallic air shift against her skin as she approached the plane. The flight attendant at the cabin door greeted passengers with the sort of rehearsed cordiality that dissolved into habit. Her eyes flicked briefly over Sophia, then past her, as if she were scanning for someone else more deserving of attention. Sophia offered a smile, though she received none in return. She found her seat near the front of the first-class cabin. 2A, by the window. It was a seat she had chosen intentionally, not for the view, but for the symbolic space it represented. It was hers, a space she had earned, paid for, and claimed without apology. As she settled in, placing her leather handbag beneath the seat in front of her and pulling out a book, the cabin filled steadily. The muted luxury of first class began to hum with activity, soft exchanges, hushed voices, the rustling of newspapers. The man across the aisle, a middle-aged executive type, glanced at her briefly, then turned away, his jaw tightening. Sophia knew that glance. It was the kind that attempted to conceal a question, a doubt, a quiet judgment. She had no interest in deciphering it. She had seen its kind too many times before. When the flight attendant, a woman named Lisa Bennett, appeared at her row, clipboard in hand, Sophia recognized the look on her face immediately. Lisa's smile was thin, her lips barely moving, as she leaned closer. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lisa said, her voice tinged with an unnecessary sweetness. "I think there might be a mix-up with your seat. Can I see your boarding pass?" Sophia looked up from her book, her expression calm but questioning. She retrieved the pass from the pocket of her blazer and handed it to Lisa, who examined it with a slight frown. "There seems to be a mistake," Lisa continued, lowering her voice but not her insistence. "This seat is reserved for first-class passengers." Sophia tilted her head, her lips forming a polite but firm smile. "There's no mistake. This is my seat." The quiet around them began to shift. Heads turned discreetly. Whispers rose like smoke curling through the air. Lisa hesitated, her professionalism faltering under the weight of the attention. She glanced again at the boarding pass, then at Sophia, as though trying to reconcile two incompatible truths. "Well," Lisa said, her tone softening into something sharper, "perhaps you intended to book a seat in the main cabin?" Sophia's smile faded, her composure hardening just slightly. "I intended to book this seat," she said simply, her voice steady. The tension hung in the air. invisible but undeniable. Lisa's face flushed as she gestured subtly toward the rear of the plane. I can find you a very comfortable seat closer to the back. Sophia paused, her gaze moving deliberately around the cabin. She caught the brief, hurried glances of passengers who were watching but feigning disinterest. When her eyes returned to Lisa, they were sharp but calm. I would prefer to stay here, Sophia said. The tension grew thicker, the murmurs louder. Lisa straightened, her professionalism replaced by a defensive rigidity. I'm afraid I have to insist. Ma'am. Sophia held her gaze for a moment longer, then sighed quietly. Without a word, she rose, gathered her belongings, and stepped into the aisle. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the dignity in her posture as unyielding as steel. As she made her way to the back of the plane, the murmurs followed her, a mix of curiosity, judgment, and discomfort. Some passengers avoided her gaze entirely, while others watched openly, their faces a canvas of conflicting emotions. When Sophia reached her new seat in the last row, she placed her bag beneath the seat and sat down. She glanced out the window, her expression calm but unreadable. In her mind, the question lingered like an unwelcome guest. How many times must I teach the same lesson to a world unwilling to learn? At the front of the plane, Lisa adjusted her uniform and resumed her duties, the faintest trace of smug satisfaction in her movements. And across the aisle in first class, Victor Holloway watched it all unfold, his sharp eyes catching every glance, every whisper, every moment of silent complicity. For Sophia, it was another moment in a lifetime of moments, small yet heavy, ordinary yet unbearable. For the others, it was just a flight. But beneath the surface, something deeper churned, a quiet storm gathering strength in the air. Sophia sat quietly at the back of the plane, the low hum of the engines filling the space around her like a veil. Outside the window, the tarmac stretched endlessly, the plane still tethered to the ground. She exhaled slowly, as if to steady something unsettled within her. There was no outburst, no scene, just the deliberate way she had risen from her seat in first class and walked toward the back. Passing rows of passengers who kept their eyes down but whose silence roared louder than any insult. And yet, she felt it. The tension lived not in what was said, but in everything that wasn't. A flight attendant brushed past her, barely acknowledging her presence as she checked overhead compartments. The cart rattled by, inches from Sophia's knee, and there was no courtesy, no excuse me, no nod of recognition. She had become, in the span of minutes, invisible. This was how it happened. It was rarely loud. There were no burning crosses, no snarling dogs, no fire hoses. Those were relics now, locked away in the minds of men who preferred to believe the past had been buried cleanly, far from the polite corridors of airports and first-class cabins. But racism had not gone anywhere. It had just learned how to whisper. Across the aisle, an elderly white woman adjusted the strap of her purse and glanced at Sophia out of the corner of her eye. Their gazes met for half a second, long enough for Sophia to recognize the flicker of unease before the woman shifted, turning toward the window as though retreating from an open flame. Sophia smiled faintly to herself. The woman wasn't afraid, not of Sophia. She was afraid of what it meant, of what it would require to confront the way things were. To accept that the world was not yet as good as she wanted to believe it was. Sophia looked away. She had seen that fear before. A shadow appeared in the aisle. Victor Holloway, the man from first class, walked toward the rear of the plane. He moved with an ease that suggested familiarity with this kind of space, how to occupy it without asking for permission. He stopped beside Sophia's row, his hand resting on the headrest of the empty seat beside her. Mind if I sit here? Sophia glanced at him, curious. Is there something wrong with your seat up front? Victor's eyes softened, but his smile was wry. Nothing's wrong with it, just not in the mood to sit alone. Sophia nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He lowered himself into the seat, leaning back and stretching his legs as though they had always belonged there. Was that necessary? Victor asked, his tone even but low enough that no one else could hear. Sophia didn't turn to him. She kept her eyes forward, watching the way the cabin filled, how each new face entered the plane with quiet expectancy. It's not about what's necessary, she replied. It's about what they expect. People like her. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the flight attendant at the front. They expect you to let it happen. To let them believe they've done nothing wrong. Victor considered this. nodding thoughtfully. I've learned, Sophia continued, her voice soft but steady. That sometimes the hardest thing isn't standing up for yourself. It's knowing when to let the silence say everything for you. Victor studied her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling between them like smoke. At the front of the plane, Lisa appeared again, her eyes scanning the cabin. She froze when she spotted Victor in the back, seated beside Sophia. Her expression tightened only for a moment, but long enough for Sophia to notice. Lisa approached quickly, her heels clicking over the carpet. She leaned in toward Victor, lowering her voice into something that hovered between respect and discomfort. Sir, I can bring you back to your original seat. There's no need to stay back here. Victor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm fine where I am. Lisa hesitated, glancing between the two of them, searching for some way to insist without making a scene. I thought you'd prefer more comfort. Victor met her gaze head on, his smile fading. I don't need to be comfortable. Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. She lingered for a moment longer, then stepped away, retreating to the galley. Victor leaned slightly toward Sophia, lowering his voice once again. You see how quickly they scramble when the rules bend in your favor? Sophia chuckled softly. It's always been that way. The moment they realize we're not asking for more, just what we've earned, it unsettles them. Victor nodded, his expression unreadable. In the quiet that followed, the plane began to taxi. Sophia glanced toward the front, catching Lisa's reflection in the polished surface of the galley door. Lisa stood stiffly, her posture betraying the kind of unease that came when the world shifted. Even slightly, from its expected orbit. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Sophia knew it wouldn't fade. The cracks had begun to show. The plane lifted, and with it, the tension Sophia carried in her chest eased just enough for her to breathe. From the window seat in the back row, she watched the shrinking world below, the neat grids of farmland and curling highways dissolving into the thick spread of clouds. She often found comfort in this moment, the quiet separation between earth and sky. Between the life she lived and the one she could imagine, if only for the length of a flight. But the weight of what happened lingered. Across the aisle, Victor Holloway sat with the casual ease of a man accustomed to being watched but unaffected by it. He leaned back, hands folded over his lap, his eyes closed. Sophia wondered if he, too, felt it, the undercurrent that still rippled through the cabin. The knowing glances, the sidelong stares, the silence that felt just a touch heavier than it had been before she took her seat at the back. It was a silence Sophia recognized well. It was the kind that lingered in the space between polite conversation and restrained hostility. The kind that didn't speak outright but made itself known in every gesture, every unspoken word. Lisa appeared once again, this time pushing the beverage cart down the aisle with the focus of someone pretending not to notice what sat directly in front of them. Victor's eyes flicked open the moment she drew near. Water, sir? Lisa asked, her tone soft but brisk. Victor took a glass, nodding his thanks. Sophia waited. Lisa's eyes swept over her without pause, the cart rolling forward before the question could leave her lips. Sophia said nothing, but Victor's gaze followed Lisa down the aisle, his expression sharpening. She didn't offer you anything, he said quietly. Sophia smiled faintly, shaking her head. She will, eventually. But they both knew that wasn't the point. It never was. This was the dance. A step forward, a step back, progress shadowed by regression so subtle it could almost be mistaken for oversight. Almost. Victor shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing toward the front of the plane where Lisa had paused to chat with another flight attendant. He was a man who rarely wore discomfort so openly, but now it hung on him like an ill-fitting coat. Would you like me to say something? He asked. Sophia chuckled softly, shaking her head. No need. Why not? Because she's already said enough. Victor considered her for a moment, leaning back once more. His eyes, however, remained fixed ahead. They both knew what would come next. The apologies, the sudden attentiveness, the offers of compensation that would never quite erase the memory of being overlooked in the first place. Sophia had experienced it too many times to expect anything different. But that was not the part that weighed on her. It was the way it settled into the bones of a place, this unspoken hierarchy. The quiet insistence that even in spaces where she had every right to exist, she still had to prove she belonged. She glanced around the cabin. noting the shifting eyes of the passengers seated near them. Some stared openly, while others feigned distraction, as if disinterest could absolve them of complicity. Sophia had grown accustomed to this, too. There was no malice in their expressions, no overt hostility. Just the soft edges of ignorance. The comfortable distance afforded to those who could afford not to know better. And in that distance, something deeper festered. Lisa reappeared, this time walking briskly down the aisle, stopping abruptly at Sophia's row. "Ma'am, can I get you something to drink?" Her voice was sweeter now, almost painfully polite. Victor's eyes flicked to Sophia, but she only smiled. "I'm fine," Sophia replied. Lisa lingered for a beat longer than necessary, as if waiting for Sophia to change her mind. When no such reprieve came, she nodded stiffly and continued her path down the aisle. Victor exhaled, shaking his head. "You know she's only asking because she saw me watching her." "Of course," Sophia said. And that, perhaps, was the part Lisa would never fully understand. It wasn't about the water. It wasn't about the seat or the gesture. It was about the distance, the measure of space between acknowledgement and indifference. Between being seen and being tolerated. A distance Sophia had learned to navigate with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime crossing it. Victor's voice broke the silence. Soft but deliberate. "She'll remember this, you know." Sophia smiled faintly, her eyes drifting back toward the clouds beyond the window. "I hope she does." The plane hung somewhere between clouds and consequence. Sophia sat in her seat, her hands resting lightly in her lap. But inside, she felt the shift, the slow, creeping weight of something coming undone. She had been here before. Not on this flight, not in this particular cabin, but in this moment. It was the moment when the quiet machinery of racism, so delicately concealed beneath pleasantries and professionalism, began to reveal itself, not all at once, but in pieces, fragments of discomfort scattering like glass on tile. Sophia recognized the pattern. It began with the glances. Small, measured things. The white man 2 rows ahead peered over his shoulder. Just briefly, his eyes lingered, unsure whether to look directly at her or through her. When she met his gaze, he turned back sharply, as if caught in the middle of something he hadn't quite decided was wrong. Then came the whispers. A pair of passengers near the front leaned toward each other. Voices hushed but not inaudible. Sophia couldn't make out the words. But she didn't need to. She had learned long ago that what people didn't say often carried more weight than what they did. Victor, seated beside her, noticed it too. "Did you hear that?" he asked under his breath. Sophia gave the faintest of smiles. "I didn't have to." Lisa, the flight attendant, reappeared at the front of the cabin. She stood straighter now, her posture betraying the nervous rigidity of someone trying to erase their own mistakes with good manners. She moved down the aisle with intention, carrying a tray of drinks she had not been asked to serve. When she stopped at Sophia's row, her smile reappeared, stretched thin over the weight of something unspoken. "Ma'am," Lisa said carefully, "I just wanted to make sure you're comfortable. Would you like something else to drink? Or a snack, perhaps?" Victor's eyes flicked to Sophia, waiting for her response. Sophia met Lisa's gaze with polite detachment. "I told you earlier I'm fine." Lisa hesitated. "Of course, but if you need anything, just let me know." Her voice softened, leaning toward apology but never fully arriving there. Sophia let the silence stretch between them. Let her feel it. Lisa lingered a second too long before continuing down the aisle. And when she was gone, Victor shook his head. "She's trying too hard." Sophia's smile was tight. "That's because she knows it's not enough." And it wasn't. Because long after Lisa's attempts to amend the slight had faded, Sophia would remember the part she played in it. This was not about water. Nor was it about the seat she had been asked to leave. It was about the quiet arithmetic of power: who was allowed to stay, who was expected to move, and how the balance shifted with every glance, every assumption, every whispered justification. And Sophia had no intention of pretending otherwise. A few rows ahead, the murmurs grew louder. Sophia could feel them, the collective discomfort of passengers sensing something off but not knowing how to address it. One of them, a middle-aged woman with silver hair and a pearl necklace, glanced back twice. On the third time, she spoke. "I couldn't help but notice earlier." The woman began hesitantly, directing her words toward Victor. "Is everything all right back here?" Victor smiled faintly, his voice smooth but edged. "Everything's fine, thank you." But Sophia could see the question behind the question. Is she supposed to be sitting there? The woman nodded, but not convincingly. She lingered just long enough for Sophia to catch the flicker of doubt in her eyes before turning back around. Sophia leaned slightly toward Victor. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Mirroring his earlier words, Victor chuckled softly, loud and clear. As the flight continued, the atmosphere thickened. Sophia could sense the divide, the split between those who wanted to forget the incident and those who couldn't stop thinking about it. Lisa avoided their row altogether now. But that avoidance carried its own weight. The absence of prejudice, after all, did not equal its opposite. Victor shifted in his seat, tapping lightly against the armrest. "You know, it's funny," he said. "People always think moments like this are isolated. A misunderstanding, a miscommunication." Sophia nodded knowingly. "Because it's easier to believe that than to ask why it happens over and over again." They sat in shared silence for a moment, the hum of the plane filling the space where words no longer felt necessary. Sophia had long understood that the real conflict was not in the single act of being dismissed from a seat. It was in the understanding that such a thing could happen at all. And more importantly, that it would happen again. The hum of the engines no longer faded into the background. It pressed against the cabin walls, wrapping itself around the tension that neither Sophia nor Victor spoke aloud. Victor sat with his hands folded, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. From time to time, he glanced toward the front of the plane, watching Lisa move through first class, her shoulders stiff with the weight of what had passed between them. But Sophia watched the passengers. She had learned, long ago, that prejudice was rarely loud. It preferred the corners of rooms, the edges of conversations, the pauses that stretched too long. And it lived here now, in the way people didn't look at her. There was a man across the aisle, 50, maybe 60. He wore a beige sweater and wire-rimmed glasses. From the moment she had been asked to move, he hadn't looked at her once. Not directly. Instead, he peered out the window as if the clouds required his full attention. Though Sophia doubted he could describe them if asked. This was how people distanced themselves, not by turning away, but by pretending they hadn't been there to begin with. Victor shifted beside her. "She hasn't looked over here in a while," he said, tilting his head toward Lisa. "She's hoping if she ignores it long enough, it'll disappear." Victor smirked, but there was no humor behind it. "Funny thing about ignoring something," Sophia continued, "it only makes it louder." The plane lurched gently as it cut through a patch of turbulence. A few rows ahead, a woman clutched the armrest, startled by the sudden shift. Sophia felt the ripple of unease move through the cabin. Fear was contagious, she thought. So was prejudice. And often, they moved in the same way. Lisa returned to the front, standing by the galley with her back turned. She whispered to another flight attendant, their conversation hushed but urgent. Victor followed Sophia's gaze. "She's talking about you," he said matter-of-factly. Sophia didn't flinch. "I know. And you're just going to sit there?" Sophia turned, meeting his eyes. "You think I haven't done this before?" Victor studied her for a moment. There was no defensiveness in her voice, only a calm certainty, the kind forged through repetition. "This isn't new," she added quietly. Victor nodded, leaning back in his seat. "Maybe not," he replied, "but it doesn't mean it should sit right." A few minutes passed before Lisa returned. She lingered at the front of the aisle, hesitating for half a breath too long. Then, as if reminding herself of some unspoken obligation, she made her way down the narrow path toward Sophia's row. "Ma'am," Lisa began, her voice softer now. "Careful." The captain wanted to extend his apologies for the misunderstanding earlier. Victor shifted, but Sophia raised a hand to still him before he could speak. Lisa's eyes darted between them. "There's an open seat back in first class now," Lisa continued, forcing a smile, "if you'd like to return." The offer hung in the air, fragile and insincere. Sophia didn't move. She could feel the weight of the cabin pressing in, passengers suddenly interested in their magazines, their phones, the in-flight safety card they had read a dozen times before. It was a curious thing, how invested people became in anything but the discomfort in front of them. "No, thank you," Sophia said simply. Lisa's eyes flickered with something confusion. "Perhaps. I appreciate the offer," Sophia added, "but I'm fine right here." Lisa lingered, her mouth parting slightly as if to argue. But no words came. She nodded stiffly, retreating down the aisle. Victor exhaled, shaking his head. You're making a point. Sophia smiled faintly. I always am. For the next hour, the flight settled into something resembling normalcy. Drinks were served. Conversations resumed. But even as the quiet returned, Sophia could feel the undercurrent that remained. The discomfort wasn't gone. It had simply rearranged itself. Like furniture shifted to make room for something larger. And that was the part people never seemed to understand. Racism didn't disappear just because the apology came. It lingered, wrapping itself around every gesture, every glance that followed. Sophia had no desire to move back to first class. Not because of pride or stubbornness, but because she understood something that Lisa and many others did not. You cannot erase a moment by pretending it didn't happen. The only thing you could do was sit with it. Let it fill the room until the people who built the discomfort were forced to bear its weight alongside you. And for Sophia, that was enough. The sky outside darkened as the plane slid further into its route. The soft hum of engines filled the space where words had once lingered. Victor shifted beside Sophia, but she remained still, her hands folded neatly over her lap. Her gaze fixed out the window as though the clouds held answers she hadn't asked for. It was the stillness that unnerved them. Not the passengers, not Lisa, not Victor. It was them, the unspoken they, the weight of generations that had taught the world to expect certain bodies in certain spaces. To challenge those expectations wasn't defiance. It was simply living. And yet, the act of sitting in this seat, in the back of this plane, after everything that had unfolded, felt less like a decision and more like a reminder. Victor's voice broke the silence. You know she's waiting for you to change your mind. Sophia smiled faintly but didn't turn. I know. Lisa hadn't passed their row since the last exchange. She lingered near the galley, her back stiff, her eyes flicking over the heads of passengers like a bird scanning for predators. She thinks if she offers enough times, she can undo it, Victor added. Sophia finally glanced his way. Undo what? Victor's brow furrowed slightly, as if he hadn't expected the question. The seat, the mistake. Sophia's gaze softened, though not with sympathy. It's not the seat she's trying to undo, she said quietly. Victor tilted his head. What is it, then? Sophia's voice was calm, but edged with the kind of certainty that only came from years of holding the weight of this world. She's trying to undo knowing. Victor stared at her for a long moment, then slowly leaned back into his seat. He understood. There were things, Sophia knew, that white people lived their entire lives not having to see truths wrapped so tightly in silence they became invisible, even as they shaped the air around them. But once that veil slipped, even slightly, there was no going back. Lisa had seen herself, and it was that which unsettled her. The cabin lights dimmed, passengers sank further into their seats, and the quiet hum of the plane lulled many into uneasy sleep. But Sophia stayed awake, watching the aisle like it might reveal something she hadn't yet considered. Victor's voice drifted softly beside her. You know this isn't over when we land, right? Sophia's lips curled faintly. It never is. 30 minutes passed before Lisa appeared again. Her steps slower this time, measured as though she had rehearsed what was to come. She stopped just short of their row, her eyes meeting Sophia's, searching for something, permission, maybe, forgiveness, if such a thing could be granted in a moment like this. Ma'am, Lisa began, her voice carefully controlled. Sophia raised a hand gently, and Lisa stopped mid-sentence. Victor straightened beside her, watching closely. Sophia's gaze was soft but steady, unwavering as it held Lisa's. You don't have to apologize again, Sophia said, her tone calm but firm. I heard you the first time. Lisa opened her mouth, but nothing followed. There it was, the thing no one liked to name. The apology, Sophia knew, had never been about her. It was about relief, a salve to soothe Lisa's discomfort, to lift the weight from her shoulders and place it somewhere else. But Sophia refused to hold it. She let the silence stretch between them, long enough for Lisa to feel the full shape of it. When Lisa finally nodded and stepped away, there was no resentment in Sophia's heart, only a quiet understanding that some lessons could not be rushed. Victor exhaled beside her, shaking his head with a faint smile. You're good at this, he said softly. Sophia chuckled under her breath. I've had practice. And as the plane cruised further into the night, Sophia returned to her view of the stars beyond the glass, feeling the slow, inevitable shift of the world turning beneath them. The plane settled into the rhythm of night travel. A fragile stillness stretched across the cabin, fragile because Sophia knew how easily it could be broken. Somewhere in the hum of engines and the soft clinking of glasses, there was a tension that never quite left the air. It hovered, lingering like the faint scent of something forgotten yet familiar. Victor's breathing had slowed beside her, though Sophia doubted he was truly asleep. The tension lay between them too, quiet but tangible, like the weight of a question neither had yet voiced. Across the aisle, the man in the beige sweater shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been pretending to sleep, but Sophia noticed the subtle flick of his eyes each time Lisa passed by. He was waiting. They all were, waiting for the moment when everything would snap back into its proper place. When the balance tilted ever so slightly by Sophia's refusal to move would be restored. But Sophia had no intention of giving them that. The turbulence began subtly, like the first ripple in an otherwise calm lake. A tremor beneath the feet. A nudge that went unnoticed by most. Lisa reappeared at the front of the cabin, speaking in low tones with another flight attendant. Her eyes flicked toward Sophia's row but darted away just as quickly. Victor opened his eyes, sitting up straighter. "What now?" he murmured. Sophia's gaze remained forward. "She's deciding how far she's willing to let this go." Victor frowned. "What do you mean?" Sophia turned slightly, lowering her voice. "You saw her face when I refused to move. She thought that would be the end of it. Now, she's realizing that whatever power she thought she had doesn't work on me." Victor exhaled slowly, his hand tightening on the armrest. "She's the flight attendant," he said. "She thinks she has the power." Sophia gave a faint smile. "That's the problem. She thinks it's hers to hold." The turbulence grew worse. Passengers stirred, some pulling their blankets higher, others adjusting in their seats. The plane's lights dimmed further, the cabin slipping into a quiet lull punctuated only by the occasional announcement from the cockpit. But beneath it all, Sophia could feel the discomfort simmering. It wasn't the turbulence unsettling them. It was her. Lisa passed by again, this time pausing for just a moment longer at Sophia's row. "Ma'am, can I get you anything?" Sophia's eyes met hers, calm and unwavering. "No, thank you." Lisa lingered, the pause stretched thin, taut like a wire waiting to snap. Victor straightened beside Sophia, his gaze locked on Lisa. "Everything all right?" Victor asked, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the tension. Lisa blinked, flustered. "Yes, sir. Just wanted to make sure she was comfortable." Sophia's smile was polite, but there was steel beneath it. "I've been comfortable this whole time," Sophia replied. Lisa nodded stiffly, retreating toward the front. Victor leaned closer, lowering his voice. "She's unraveling." Sophia's eyes softened. "She's learning." But learning had its cost. As the plane continued its journey, the murmurs returned, quiet at first, but unmistakable. Sophia could feel it, the subtle shift of judgment moving like a current beneath the surface. She caught snippets of conversations. The hushed tone of the elderly couple in the row ahead. The way the woman in pearls leaned toward her companion, whispering just low enough to avoid being heard. Sophia didn't need to hear the words to know their shape. She had lived this scene before. In restaurants, in lobbies, in meeting rooms where she was the only black woman at the table. It was never about what was said. It was about the collective understanding that she did not belong, not fully. Not without question. And for some, that knowledge was more unsettling than the turbulence. Victor noticed it too. His eyes flicked around the cabin, reading the body language of those around them. "Do you want me to say something?" he asked softly. Sophia shook her head. "This isn't about them," she said. "It's about her." Victor's gaze followed Lisa, who was now speaking with the co-pilot at the front of the plane. "She's not going to forget this," Victor murmured. Sophia's smile was faint. "That's the point." The turbulence settled, but the tension did not. As the plane drifted through the night sky, Sophia remained still, grounded by the weight of her own refusal. She thought of all the times she had been asked to move, not physically, but subtly, to shrink, to adjust, to make herself less visible, less noticeable, so that others could return to their comfort undisturbed. And she thought of all the times she had complied. But not tonight. Not this time. Somewhere in the dark cabin, Lisa stood near the galley. glancing back toward Sophia's row with the quiet discomfort of someone who had come face to face with herself and found no refuge in the reflection. Sophia closed her eyes, letting the silence settle over her. She wasn't waiting for the apology. She was waiting for the lesson to sink in. The plane began its descent. The captain's voice, calm and assured, floated through the speakers, but his words hardly registered. There was a different kind of descent happening. Sophia felt it in the way Lisa hovered near the galley, pretending to organize cups that didn't need organizing. She felt it in the passengers, how their eyes darted toward her when they thought she wasn't looking. How the man in the beige sweater shifted so often it seemed as if he might disappear into the seat itself. Victor tapped the armrest rhythmically. Each knock against the plastic a quiet reminder that time was running out. "She's going to try again before we land," he said without looking at her. Sophia smiled faintly. "I know." Victor shook his head. "You'd think she'd let it go by now." Sophia's gaze drifted to the window. Lights flickered below. The city spread out beneath them like a cluster of stars just within reach. "She can't," Sophia said softly. "Not yet." Lisa's footsteps approached, and this time, Sophia didn't turn to meet them. She kept her gaze outside, as if the world beyond the glass held more importance than whatever would unfold in this narrow aisle. "Ma'am," Lisa began, quieter this time. Sophia didn't answer immediately. There was power in making them wait. When she finally looked up, Lisa's expression faltered. I wanted to check one last time if you'd like to return to your original seat." Victor exhaled sharply through his nose. "You don't give up, do you?" Lisa flinched at the remark but kept her focus on Sophia. Sophia considered her carefully. Lisa's posture betrayed her shoulders drawn in slightly, hands clasped together like a schoolgirl awaiting reprimand. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It hadn't been for hours. Lisa wanted something else. Relief. Closure. A lifting of the weight that had settled over her the moment she asked Sophia to move. Sophia let the silence stretch between them until she could almost hear the question forming behind Lisa's eyes. "Can't we make this right?" Sophia's voice, when it came, was soft but unyielding. "You didn't ask me to move because of my seat." Lisa blinked, caught off guard. "You asked me to move because of what you thought you saw." Sophia continued, "Because something about me sitting there didn't fit the picture in your head." The air in the cabin shifted. Victor sat still, watching the exchange as though it were unfolding on a stage. Lisa opened her mouth, but nothing followed. Sophia smiled gently, though there was no humor in it. "I'm not angry," she said, "but I need you to understand something." Lisa nodded faintly, eyes wide, as if bracing herself. "Moving me wasn't the mistake," Sophia said. "The mistake was believing that I wouldn't notice why you did it." Lisa's breath caught. Sophia held her gaze, steady and calm. "You can offer me that seat 100 more times," Sophia continued, "but until you really see me it won't mean anything." Lisa swallowed, her cheeks burning with the quiet sting of recognition. For the first time, she lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Sophia nodded once. "I know." Victor leaned closer, his voice low and even. "Now sit with it, Lisa." Lisa stepped back, retreating toward the front of the plane, her hands trembling at her sides. The cabin felt different now, as if something had shifted beneath the surface, an invisible thread pulled tight. No longer frayed but knotted, holding the weight of the unspoken truths between them. As the plane touched down, Sophia felt the jolt in her chest. Not from the landing, but from the simple fact that she had remained exactly where she chose to be. Victor stood and retrieved his bag, waiting as Sophia slowly gathered her things. Passengers began to file out, but Sophia lingered in her seat, watching the slow shuffle of feet down the aisle. She had no interest in being the first to leave. Lisa stood near the exit, her eyes catching Sophia's one final time. Sophia met her gaze and held it. No words passed between them. And yet, the weight of that silence was enough. Victor stepped aside as Sophia exited the plane. The cool night air swept through the jet bridge, but the heaviness didn't lift. Victor broke the quiet as they walked toward the terminal. "She'll remember this," he said. Sophia smiled softly. "I hope so." Victor glanced at her sideways. "And if she doesn't?" Sophia's eyes flicked toward the lights of the terminal ahead, her steps calm and deliberate. "Then she'll find herself in this moment again," Sophia replied, "because the lesson always returns until it's learned." Victor nodded. True enough. As they stepped into the terminal, Sophia felt the weight of every small battle fought before this one, each moment when she had been asked, in one way or another, to shrink. But not tonight. Tonight, she had stayed exactly where she was meant to be. And that, Sophia knew, was enough to change everything.